So 10 years ago, I noticed that the conversations I was having with my business owner clients began to change. As the baby boomers are turning 74 this year, these folks were in their late 50s and 60s. And what I recognized is that they were beginning to think about succession, and appropriately so. And so the first conversation was about, I'm starting to think about succession. I have a pretty good idea of who I want to be my successor. And I'd like to confirm with that person that they are interested. All of those things make great sense. And then what I started noticing as the conversation progressed was there would be this interesting push-pull. They confirmed the successor was interested, which was great news. And as they started to release some of the responsibility to that successor, they started pulling back. And so there was this dance that went back and forth between, I want you to take on more responsibility in the company, and then, but not that way. And then I'd like you to expand the impact that you're having, but not right now. And so that dance went back and forth. And as I noticed that and started to pay attention to what was going on, I got really curious as to what was behind all of it. So I started doing a bunch of research. And what I want to share with you today is what I found. Some of that research is information that's very well known and well understood. And some of it unfolded into the hidden aspects of succession and exit. And so that's what I'm going to walk through with you today. So what I'd like you to do is take out a pen and paper. And as I'm going through this, whether your timeline for succession is 1 year or 10 years or longer, I'd still like you to pay attention to how does this apply to me, or how can this apply to me? So as we're going through, what I'm hoping is that you will identify a couple of things that might be applicable for your business or your role, no matter what role you play in a company. So I'll tell you a little bit about me. I've had the Leadership and Legacy Group since 2013. Prior to that, my career was with Sandler Training and Procter & Gamble. And I've got a background in statistics, and I'm originally from Poughkeepsie, New York. So the Leadership and Legacy Group works with business owners and senior leaders on the leadership side of succession and exit. So our focus is really developing strong leaders who can take over and run the company profitably and sustainably as the owner exits the business. We also work with folks that are in their 50s, 60s, and 70s that are trying to figure out what their next chapter might look like. And then we work with those owners to enhance the strategic value of their business and figure out how to have some of those difficult conversations and difficult decisions that they need to make. Now, we're in a very interesting time, as we all know, so we're all facing a massive amount of uncertainty. The pandemic is obviously a significant piece of that, but there are also all kinds of other issues that are happening around us that business owners are struggling with, and so are their employees. So whether it's the economy, whether it's racial equity, the political divisiveness with the election right around the corner, and then a shift from working from the office to working from home and schooling from home. So there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of stress, and what I learned from Spartan planning and branding is that uncertainty is far more stressful than a known negative outcome. And that's what we're facing right now. So most of us are looking for ways to feel more in control. A study by LinkedIn indicated that over 60% of C-suite leaders have found this to be the most challenging experience in their career. They've had to make some really difficult business decisions, and they've struggled because, quite frankly, they don't have all the answers. None of us do right now. And over 50% said that at times they doubted even their ability to lead. That's pretty unsettling. One of the common things that has shown up is something called decision fatigue. And for those of you that have studied and read about Steve Jobs, he said that decision fatigue was something he wanted to avoid. And that's why he spent the majority of his decision-making power focused on strategic decisions. And that's why he wore the same clothes every day. Not the exact same clothes, he had different outfits, of course. But he wore the same uniform every day because it was one less decision he needed to make. So while we're facing those kinds of challenges, we also recognize that business owners are getting older. the early wave of baby boomers is turning 74 this year. And so the owners are starting to think more seriously, not just about their business, but about their own health and well-being and that of their family. So the triad, you may not know this, but for those of you in the triad is the 12th in the country for aging business owners. And 8 million businesses are scheduled to change hands in the next 9 years based on those demographics. We also know that 25% of the workforce is over age 55, and 40% of the workforce in 2020 are millennials. So when you look at where those succession plans are going to lead, those successors are likely to be millennials who are eager and anxious to take over. But the problem is that 75% of the successor candidates, they're just not ready yet. They can be ready, but they're not ready yet. So there's a concept called the rolling 10 that I learned from another leader in the succession and exit space. And he talks about how business owners will often say, I'm planning on exiting my business in the next 5 to 10 years. And then you talk to them 3 to 5 years later and ask them when they're planning on exiting their business. And they say, 5 to 10 years. And then you see them 3 to 5 years later and you ask them when they're planning on exiting their business. And they say 5 to 10 years. So the time of exit is always rolling forward. This slide talks about what I hear from business owners from time to time. I should have sold 5 years ago when the economy was really strong. I'm now 70 and my business has taken a hit. It's harder to sell the business at a high valuation if it's taken a hit. At 72, I thought my business was worth $10 million, but it's not. So we know that every owner will exit their business one day. The question is, will they exit on their terms? So an interesting statistic that floored me was that 75% of business owners want to sell their business. Now, not every business owner does, but of the ones that want to sell their business, only 20% of those businesses actually sell, which means a lot of them are just shutting down and liquidating. So if you as a business owner do want to sell your business, some of the things we're going to talk about now are important for you to keep in mind and work on. So we know that selling a business is fraught with uncertainty, and we're already in uncertain times. Why is it so uncertain? Well, there are a whole host of reasons. First of all, most business owners have never sold a business before. This is their first time. It's a new experience. And we know that we don't like to have new experiences that have so much at stake when we're in our 60s or 70s. In addition to that stress and uncertainty, a sale of a business is often a very complex transaction. There are financial implications, tax implications. Nobody wants to feel like a chump. So in addition to that, there are difficult conversations that we often need to have with our direct reports and with the employees that work with us. We might even have to have difficult conversations with our family members. So there's a lot of discomfort in going through the process. It takes time, it costs money, and unfortunately there are no guarantees. Oftentimes, even until you get to that final day of closing, there are no guarantees. So let's talk about some things that we know first. We know that if you're going to sell your business, you need a qualified buyer. So the criteria in my mind that define a qualified buyer are first, they want the business. That's a good start. Second, they can pay for it. They have the means to get the dollars to cover what you're asking for it and what they've agreed to pay for it. Now, if it's a family member or key employee, for the most part, you're likely going to have to finance the sale of that business. That may be perfectly okay. If it's not, then they have to have access to resources to get it a different way. And I have a story that was interesting a couple of years ago where I was working with a business owner who had somebody that was in the industry that had expressed interest in buying his business. And he expressed interest in selling to him, so it seemed like a perfect win-win. And when I encouraged him to find out where the money was going to come from, and he asked that question, the expected buyer came back and said, well, you know, I'm raising money from family and friends. And when we found out how much money he was going to be actually able to raise from family and friends, it was way short of what the owner needed to even get started financing the business. So they've got to be able to pay for it. They have to be willing to pull the trigger. A lot of times we talk about things as being really exciting, and then when it gets down to the final moment where we're about to sign on the dotted line, there's a moment of panic. You know, you've heard of cold feet related to weddings. Well, this might be cold feet related to going through with the purchase. If you get to that point, you have to know that they can run it profitably and sustainably. And so if you're financing it, that's critically important, because if you're financing it and they can't run it profitably, well, then you're going to have to come back in and take it over again or see it deteriorate. And neither of those options are probably good for you. You also need to have somebody who is trusted. And one of the things that I hear most often from the clients that I work with that are looking to sell their business is they care more about finding a trusted buyer who can afford a fair price than getting the most value out of their business. So they want to see their legacy continue, and it makes sense. So if those things are not met, then obviously you don't have a sale. The buyer options, well, there are some very obvious options. A lot of people say, hey, no sweat. My kids are going to buy me out. Well, 23% of owners do sell to their children. The challenge is maintaining it generationally. So 33% of businesses actually survive to the second generation, 13% to the third, and then 6% survive to the fourth generation. So 41% sell to key employees, or they sell to an ESOP. That's become very popular recently. And then 29% sell to a third-party buyer, somebody outside. It could be private equity or somebody else that they didn't know before they started the sales process. An additional thing that's important to know if you're selling to children or even key employees and family or an ESOP is that it generally takes an average of 3 to 5 years to prepare someone who's a high potential VP level to be the CEO of a company. So you've got to prepare for that time. The other question that often is on people's minds is, what's my business worth? So unfortunately for many companies, it's less than what they expected. So the statistics that I researched said that 16% of companies are worth less than $2 million. 48%, the vast majority, are worth somewhere between $2 and $10 million. And then 36% are worth more than $10 million. Most people that own a business believe that their business is probably worth more than it is. That's the general belief. And the truth is that it's only worth what a buyer is willing and able to pay for it. So the question for owners is, can I get enough? And it's enough from an ego standpoint, it's enough from a what do I want standpoint. But the biggest question is really, is it enough to maintain the lifestyle that you've become accustomed to? And is it realistic? Will someone actually pay that? Other things that business owners often don't think about as much, but is important, is what matters most to enable you to exit on your terms. So the things that I hear that matter most, everyone's going to say sales price. Again, it's because nobody wants to be taken advantage of. The other things that matter is the timing. Some people, I just recently worked with a business owner who was preparing to sell his business. And the first thing that he told me is he'd like to be out in 6 months. Well, 6 months is a pretty aggressive timeline. So if you can't plan for beyond 6 months, you're at risk of selling it for less than what you think it's worth. So the timing matters. You have to have that trusted successor, and most owners want that, as I mentioned before. And then it's about taking care of your employees and exiting well. So a lot of folks that I talk to tell me that they really want to make sure that their employees are taken care of. So even if they're selling to another firm or they're selling to private equity, they spend a lot of time thinking about the culture of the buyer and making sure that the culture of the buyer or the buyer's company is going to be similar enough to their culture, that their employees have a smooth transition and that they feel cared for. So I want to talk about some of the hidden aspects, and I've put together the Donnelly Method to help explain some of that, so we can go through and talk a little bit more about some of the things that maybe as a business owner or as a successor you might not have given a lot of thought to. So the Donnelly Method has several components, and I'm going to go through each of those in detail. So the first component is around strategic growth. Every business owner that's selling their business wants to see the business continue and survive, or if not even thrive, under the new ownership. So the strategic growth is really about figuring out what are your strengths. You could do a SWOT analysis for sure, and I often do that when I'm doing a strategic plan with a company. But the strengths and opportunities really show you what the potential is. And so leveraging your strengths and seeking out those growth opportunities is the first phase of that strategic growth process. And then it's thinking through, is your strategy compelling? Does the buyer feel like they can execute that strategy? And will it deliver a profitable, sustainable business, not just today, because you've got a long future ahead, but also in that future? So if you have a strategy, but the new owners can't execute it, that's not going to work. If you have a group of owners or a new owner that can execute that strategy, but it's not going to be sustainable for the future, you've probably got to come up together with a new strategy. You've also got to have a strong, competent management team. I mentioned earlier it takes 3 to 5 years to develop a CEO, and that's starting at a VP position. The reason is that CEOs have a very different role than most VPs. CEOs have to not only be that strategic lens, but they have to balance their look inside the organization and outside the organization. So 76% of successors are not ready, and really it's about figuring out who's the best choice to run your company versus the default of the expected choice. And these are some of the difficult conversations that I have oftentimes with owners, is helping them figure out really who's the best choice, and then how do they position that person for success, knowing that there's an expected choice that may not be the best fit. So sometimes those conversations are uncomfortable, sometimes they're difficult, but there's always a way to have them, and in most cases, having them right results in very positive outcomes for all. When an owner is trying to figure out how to develop that successor for those next stages, it's all about intentional development. And I'm going to go through a couple of things here to give you some ideas on how you can intentionally develop the people that work for you. And certainly I'm focusing this on the successor, but it doesn't have to only be the successor that you apply this to. It's really anyone in your organization. So the first piece of that process of intentional development is really assessing who's ready now for more responsibility, who can take on a bigger role, who can expand their impact, and then who can be ready in the next 3 years. And we'll talk about high potentials in a moment. The other thing that a lot of companies don't think about, or a lot of owners don't think about, is which roles in your organization are strategic for your business. So for example, if you're a sales-oriented company, and many companies are, then your sales VP role is a strategic role. If your company is operationally focused, the key unique differentiator between your business and others is your operational excellence, then your operations roles are critical. So looking at which roles are critical is an important factor. Looking at the skills and experience that the folks in your organization bring is also a really important factor for you to consider as you're thinking through, who do I need to develop? And then of course, it's not the last one, but one of the other key ones is around culture fit. So you may have some fantastic performers in your organization, but if the environment that they would lead in, or the style that they would lead, is culturally different than the style that you have built the company, and it's not a good fit for the future, it may actually be a good fit for the future, but if it's not, then you need to work on either creating a stronger, more adaptable culture to that style, or adjusting the style of the leader that you have in mind. So it's all about creating experience-based development that's very intentional. And I'll give you some examples of what I mean by experience-based development in a couple of slides. So one of the tools that can be really helpful as you, as an owner, are thinking through this is called a 9-box. And the 9-box looks at, it's actually a graph. And on the x-axis, you've got the potential. And on the other axis, you've got the performance. And so you're looking at what's the potential of the key leaders that you've got, and then how is their performance in their current job. And you're looking to figure out, ideally, who's got high performance in their current job and has high potential, because that person is likely to be able to develop and take on way more responsibility. It also starts to surface and highlight who in your organization is probably not a good long-term fit. And those might be people that have low performance today and low potential to grow. And you can see along the two axes, you can look at, you might have some folks that have tremendous potential, but are not doing a very good job in their current role. So it says move them into a role where they can be more successful. You may have some folks that are doing a terrific job in their current role, but probably don't have potential to grow into higher level roles in the organization. Great, then keep them happy in the role that they're doing and keep them engaged. If you can do that, they'll be a wonderful long-term performer for your company. So let's talk about how do you develop that talent. So you see I've got a triangle here, and there's a rule called the 70-20-10 rule. And what that means is that you want to be spending 70% of your development investment in the bottom part of that triangle around experiences. But it's not just giving people experiences. It's really being intentional about giving them stretch assignments, putting them into a job rotation where they get experience in other parts of the company, real experience, like a day in the life or a week in the life. When I worked at Procter & Gamble, we were exceptional at figuring out how do we give people developmental experiences. So we might take a 3-month assignment, that was a stretch assignment, to immerse us in a different part of the company or a different role. We might do a job rotation where we rotate in for a year into another part of the business or into another role. There are pilot projects. I remember being scooped out of my role to work part-time on a pilot project. I probably spent about 10 hours a week on that pilot project, and it gave me phenomenal experience. Things like getting on the leadership of a board. Could be your board, but more likely it might be a board of another organization, maybe a nonprofit that is important to that person. Cross-functional projects give you opportunities, give your folks opportunities to work across the company to pick up skills that they might not have been able to pick up otherwise. Other ideas, and I've got a whole list of ideas on my website. There are a couple of documents that can help you with this if you're looking for more ideas. The last one I have listed here is the peer roundtable. And there are a lot of peer groups for CEOs. There are also peer groups for the next level in the organization, and even some industry-type peer groups, and also role-type peer groups, like CFO peer groups, things like that. So giving someone an opportunity to do something like that broadens their exposure and helps them understand broader business experience as well as what the rest of the business world is like. So the idea there is that you have a strong business strategy, you develop your talent, and then you encourage them to reflect and take new action. Now, of course, the other ways of developing talent, I'm sure that you're all very familiar with. There's coaching and mentoring, and the statistics show, of course I'm a little biased, I'm a coach, but the statistics show that coaching and mentoring works very well, but it's not right for everyone, and it's not right all the time. So coaching can also be informal coaching that you're doing with your folks, or that you have peer coaching set up. And 360s, assessments, things like that can also be good, effective coaching. The last one is formal training. And so that's classroom experience, it could be workshops, it could be anything that takes them out of the office, or at least these days virtual is also another way of getting that. So let's talk about I mentioned the role components and how important those were to look at what drives the roles in your company. First of all, not all executive functions are critical. They're all important to the organization, but not all are critical to that unique competitive advantage that you bring. So I talked earlier about managing operations, maybe leading strategy, selling. In some companies, the marketing and social media aspect of it is what differentiates the business. So you've got to look at your business and figure out which of these drivers are most important for you, and then make sure you've got real strong talent in those roles as a development, either towards a successor or simply as a part of your strong leadership team now and in the future. So let's also talk about the next component of the Donnelly Method, and that's implementing sustainable systems. Now we know that systems are important to an organization, but we also know that not all systems are the same. So value drivers, there's been a lot of research done on this, value drivers are the best way to figure out what's going to make your company more valuable, whether you're selling it to a key employee or a family person, or you are selling it to someone outside, a third party. You're still going to want the value of your business to strengthen no matter what. So here are some of the things that show up as important value drivers. The first and most obvious is having strong and clean financials. If you've got those in place, that's probably a good chunk of what it's going to take to make your company more valuable to somebody else. But the other factors that are important are things like having that strong management team. Folks that are buying your company want to know that you've got the bench strength to be able to continue running the business, even if they're going to send in some folks to help run the business with you. Other things that are important are owner independence. If you can take a month of vacation or 3 months of vacation and you don't have to worry what's going on in the company, you've got owner independence. I have a client right now who is able to take off weeks at a time to travel, to take vacation, to do really whatever he would like, because he's got such a strong management team that's leading the company right now. And he's still in his mid-50s. So to think about a business that's that well situated is very exciting. Other things that are important to value from a value driver standpoint are customer loyalty. If you have a long track record, not just of single customer, because that's dangerous, but if you have a very diverse customer base and a long track record of repeat buyers that stay with you forever, that's very attractive to a buyer. Other things include that recurring revenue, and there are a couple of books written by John Morello. One is called Built to Sell, the other is called The Automatic Customer, that I would recommend to help you with some of this value driver information. And also, Automatic Customer is all about recurring revenue streams. And really, who wouldn't like recurring revenue streams? I think we all would like our businesses to have those. The last one on the list is scalability. And so your ability to take your business today and ramp it up as you have growth potential is another valuable asset to a buyer. So figuring out your value drivers and where you can invest value today in growing the business for tomorrow, I think is a worthwhile exploration process. So now let's get to some of the other pieces of what happens with business owners. Most business owners have built their business over 20, 30, sometimes 40 years, and their identity is deep in that business. It's like another child to many of them. It's offered them a lot of status, a lot of control. They control their own destiny. It's given them power and autonomy. And so the question when they think about moving on out of the business is, what will I do in this next chapter of my life? Who will I be when I'm not running this company? And oftentimes as leaders transition out of their business, some of the things that I hear from them is I don't know how to introduce myself as I'm meeting people and I'm no longer the owner of my company. Do I say I used to be the owner or I used to be the CEO? I've got to come up with a new identity. And that's a really important transition. This process of exiting a business is extremely emotional. And I know it's hard to talk about the emotional aspect of it, but if we don't talk about it and we don't deal with it, it has the potential of derailing the process that is otherwise going very, very well and a win for everybody. So I've built a mechanism, a model that has worked extremely well with the clients that I've worked with over the last really 15 years. Have a lot of success stories, and I'd like to take you through that model and show you kind of the flow of the process and give you some ideas about things that you can do to start preparing for that. So the whole idea of this model is that as business owners, I know that having a smooth transition is important, but having a smooth transition may not be as easy as often we would like to think it is. And so the part of the process, this process I'm going to take you through, is really a two-stage process, with the third stage that you're in your happy place after you've exited the business or defined a new role for yourself in the business. And that's a critical piece of it. The transition is hard, and it's often made harder when roles are not clearly defined, when decision-making processes and the scope of authority for those decision-making processes are unclear. And there's a little bit of a bid for power going on, because the owner wants to relinquish it, but as I said earlier, but kind of might not. Or they want to relinquish it, but they see a decision being made that they just know is wrong, and they want to jump in. But if they jump in, then it impacts the successor's confidence or their ability to execute upon a new strategic direction that they've discussed already. So it's complicated. So I like to start working with owners at least 6 months before their transition out of the role, even if they're not planning on exiting the business quite yet, because it helps with the emotional aspects of that transition, and it really helps the successor be more successful in that transition. So the first phase of the process is called the discovery process, and it's all internal work. It's a lot of self-reflection, it's a lot of soul-searching, it's a lot of thinking about who we are as individuals and what we're passionate about and what we're really best at. So we look at 3 components. You can probably see, if you look closely, that there's a Venn diagram with 3 components. And the first component is around, what are you passionate about? And that's not really about, ooh, I love watching football on TV, that's great. But there are probably a number of other things that every person can figure out that they're passionate about. And I know that if you're listening right now or watching, you may be thinking, but I don't know what I'm passionate about. Most people don't when we start working together. But there are a number of tools that can help to uncover that. One of the exercises that I often ask clients to do is I ask them to think about what are some of the accomplishments that they're proudest of. And they could be accomplishments that they would love to have on the front page of the newspaper. But they might also be accomplishments that are personal victories for them. And so the accomplishments that we're proudest of often have in them seeds of what we're passionate about. And so that's an example of the kinds of questions that I might encourage owners to think about. It's also a really good technique. I use it a lot with folks that I'm working with that are in their 50s, 60s, and 70s and are thinking about a career transition. The other question that I like to ask them to consider are, tell me about times when you totally lost track of time. What were you doing? And often that answering that question brings seeds of where there are uncoverable passions. So passion is a pretty important piece of this, because in our next chapter, whether we're going to stay with the company, we're going to change careers, or we're going to exit the business, we want our life to be filled with things that are meaningful and rewarding, and often that has to do with our passions. The second piece of the Venn diagram is around what are your favorite strengths to use. You know, at this point in your career, you don't have to use the strengths that you don't like anymore. At this point, we want to really focus in on what are your favorite strengths to use. What are the strengths that really light you up? And there are a number of different ways that we can get at that. But one of my favorite ways to get at it, in addition to asking, you know, what are the strengths that you enjoy using the most, is to get some feedback from other people. Talk to some people, not do a 360. I'm not really terribly interested in the things that you don't do well, but really, what are the things that they see you do exceptionally well? What are your hidden or visible talents? What are the things that you do better than anybody else that they know? And sometimes that feedback is confirming and validating, and sometimes it's enlightening. So figuring that out is a critical piece of the process. And then the third piece of the Venn diagram is what lifestyle priorities are important to you at this stage. A lot of folks tell me that they're really tired of getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and they'd really like to be able to sleep until maybe 6:30. So that's a lifestyle priority to put into this process. Others tell me they want to be able to travel more. Most people, when I ask, what do you want to do in retirement? I get the same 3 answers. I've done this in front of thousands, literally, of people. And the 3 answers that I get almost all the time are, I want to spend more time with family, I want to travel, and I want to play a lot more golf. Sometimes it's tennis, but usually it's golf. And those things are great, and they ought to be incorporated into a next chapter. But they're often not sufficient to satisfy the vast majority of people. So once we identify those 3 components, then we can start to put together a narrative that starts to frame out what that next chapter might look like. And I don't expect at that point that anyone's really going to know that. But they start to see the components of what that might be. And that leads us to phase 2. They've got that narrative, and in phase 2 of the process, they begin to explore by having conversations with people, by investigating organizations or associations that might be of interest to them, and asking what kind of work is out there, whether it's paid or not, what kind of volunteer work is out there, what kind of opportunities are out there. And when we start to express interest in other areas, not only do we learn a lot more, but other people start to get interested in us as well. And others can start to see the potential that we can bring and want to draw us in. But in drawing us in this way, they start to see what we can bring because we're clear on what we want to do next and the direction we want to go. So the process is, it's very powerful for helping people move into that. And I like to think about it as a fulcrum, because once an owner gets excited about what that next chapter can look like and sees that there is potential, even if they don't have the whole picture lined up, even if they don't know exactly what it's going to be, they can start to see what that potential is. And the more focus that they can get on that potential, the less uncomfortable they are as their successor starts to take over more of the company. And the more confident they get that the company's going to be just fine because they've done all the right work to get them there. So my closing comment is get started now. Don't bury your head in the sand. Don't do the rolling 10, but at least start with some baby steps. Start thinking about some of the things that I talked about today and get the process started. So if you're ready for a confidential conversation, certainly I would love to have that conversation with you. My contact information is right here. It's Abby@leadershiplegacygroup.com. My phone number is 336-458-9939. And I invite you to visit my website. There are some free resources there and some videos and stuff like that. And there's a copy of my book there. I'll hold a copy up here. This book goes through the Donnelly Method and a lot of what I talked about today, and will hopefully give you some ideas. It's an easy, quick, and inexpensive way to get started. So thank you very much. I'd like to thank Spartan Planning and Spartan Branding for today. It's a wonderful day. I wish we could have been live and in person. And I look forward to seeing what the rest of the day unfolds. Thank you.